We were away last weekend, took a vacation to go to the Outer Banks to see Megan's parents. They live there about half of the year. And we had a wonderful trip. Restful, relaxing. The grandparents got up every morning with the kids, so we got to sleep a little bit, which doesn't happen at our house. Clayton gets up at 5:45 or 6 o'clock every day. His mantra is, when the sun wakes up, I get up. But it was a great trip until it came time to come back. We boarded a plane in Norfolk, Virginia, to fly to Atlanta, then to Nashville. And about 20 minutes outside of Atlanta, the captain comes on and says, we have to redirect because of storms. We're flying to Jacksonville, and we have to land there. So we landed in Jacksonville. Waited on the runway in Jacksonville 2.5 hours to go back to Atlanta. We were going to go, then we weren't. We're going to go. Finally, they said, we're going to go to a gate and let you all get off the plane. Great. We went and got dinner. 45 minutes later, we're back on the plane, took off, went to Atlanta. Landed in Atlanta. Waited 2 hours to get a gate in Atlanta. Finally get to the gate, and there's nobody to bring the tunnel up to the plane, so we waited even longer. After 9 hours on that plane, minus the dinner stop, with a 3 and a 4-year-old, we got off that plane in Atlanta at 11 o'clock. I'll also tell you that at some point, Clayton said, Daddy, I got to go TT, and Megan said, it's your turn. So we walked back to the bathroom, and I was helping Clayton, and I was leaning over, and I had the door open to the bathroom just because there wasn't room for both of us in there. And my favorite pair of sunglasses fell off of my shirt and into the toilet. To make matters worse, I threw those glasses away. Well, in Atlanta, they said the first flight they could book us back on was the next night at 11 o'clock. And so they booked us on that, and then I went to 2 gates that had flights going to Nashville. I noticed that they were calling standby passengers that weren't showing up. And I said, please put us on this flight. And the guy probably saw the desperation in my eyes, and he gave us 4 tickets all over the plane, but I didn't care. And we got on the plane, got back to Nashville, no luggage. And then my bag was delivered 3 days later in the car seats, and one of the car seats was in 3 pieces. So that was our trip coming home. But isn't that the way it is in life? You get a pocket of time when you're refreshed and renewed and rejuvenated, and then boom, all of a sudden something happens to take all of that away from you. Today I'm starting a sermon series that will go through June, focusing on the spiritual life. Specifically, the title of it is The Spiritual Life in a Stressful World. This series will be based on one verse of Scripture that we find in Galatians chapter 5, where Paul identifies the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Now, we're going to look at a bunch of different scriptures under each of those headings, but that is the verse upon which this series will be based. If I were to ask you this morning, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not good at all and 10 being great, if I were to ask you, how is your spiritual life, how would you answer that on a scale of 1 to 10? Then if I were to follow that question up with which fruit or fruits of the Spirit do you need to work on this summer, how would you answer that question? Here's some thoughts by a few renowned spiritual thinkers. Henry Nouwen says, the spiritual life is not a life before, after, or beyond our everyday existence. No, the spiritual life can only be real when it is lived in the midst of the pains and joys of the here and now. Brennan Manning, the dominant characteristic of an authentic spiritual life is the gratitude that flows from trust, not only for all the gifts that I receive from God, but gratitude for all the suffering. Because in that purifying experience, suffering has often been the shortest path to intimacy with God. And then Eugene Peterson, the Presbyterian pastor, he says one way to define the spiritual life is getting so tired and fed up with yourself that you go on to something better which is following Jesus Christ. And we all know what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, then how can its saltiness be restored? You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on a lampstand, to give light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that you may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. I wrote a piece for the newspaper this weekend where I talked about a column that appeared in Newsweek magazine almost 3 years ago, written by Andrew Sullivan. And the title of that article, and it was the cover story for the magazine, was "Forget the Church, Follow Jesus." The subtitle was "Christianity has been destroyed by politics, priests, and get-rich evangelists." I'll remind you of the pastor in Atlanta a few months ago who asked his congregation to include a $60 million jet as part of their capital campaign so he could fly around and spread the gospel. I haven't asked you guys for a jet. I just wanted to lift that up this morning. But in that article, Sullivan identifies the problems with the church, which is nothing new, the scandals and the corruptions. But he also says something that's very important. He says, in the 21st century, research has proven it to be true that people today are much more interested in following Jesus of Nazareth than they are in getting tied up in institutional issues. He identifies Thomas Jefferson and St. Francis of Assisi as being two men who were very serious about their faith and about their spiritual lives. At the end of the article, he says this: true Christianity comes not from the head or the gut, but from the soul. It's as meek as it is quietly liberating. It does not seize the moment, it lets it be. It doesn't seek worldly recognition or success, and it flees from power and wealth. It is the religion of unachievement, and it is not afraid. In the anxious, crammed lives of our modern twittering souls, in the materialistic obsessions we cling to for security and recessions, in a world where sectarian extremism threatens to unleash mass destruction, this sheer Christianity, seeking truth without the expectation of resolution, simply living each day, doing what we can to fulfill God's will, is more vital than ever. And he concludes the piece by saying, something inside is telling us that we need radical spiritual change. We live in a very stressful, busy, fast-paced world, and we all know that. On that airplane last Tuesday, I had a lot of time to think about spirituality, and in particular to think about the things in life that keep us from growing spiritually, that keep us from being spiritually grounded. So here's just a few. Fear, and I preached on fear on Easter, but how Jesus' primary message throughout his life and ministry was, be not afraid. It's hard to be spiritual when you're always afraid of what might happen, afraid of what could happen. Responsibility. We all have various responsibilities in our jobs, in our marriages, as parents. Just taking care of the things that we're supposed to take care of can be very stressful. You know, the things that called me into the ministry, a desire to preach and to teach and to write, to counsel, to heal, that's not what I spend all of my time doing. Administration is often not very spiritual. Dealing with conflicts is often not very spiritual. But it's a part of the job, and all of us have responsibilities that we have to do that might not help us in our spiritual lives, but it's our reality. Conflict. There are people in life who just like to fight, and they're always creating conflict. And usually it says more about what is going on in that person's heart than it does about the particular issue that you might be fighting about. And we're going to talk more about that next week when we get to peace and patience, the second two in Paul's list. Ego control. Wanting our lives to matter, wanting our lives to be important can quickly turn into wanting others to recognize how great we are. And this isn't always very healthy for us spiritually. Possessions. As much as we love our possessions, we would have to admit that sometimes our possessions possess us. And so our stuff and our lifestyles often get in the way of being spiritual. Sometimes just trying to keep up and provide for a family is very stressful because life is expensive. These are just some of the obstacles that I see that often prevent us from living a spiritual life. And these are not things that can be avoided, but these are things that have to be navigated as we live. The first two fruits of the Spirit that Paul lists are love and joy. And I happen to think that those two are very closely related. 1 John says that we should love one another because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. And then we find that famous passage by the Apostle Paul to the Corinthians where he says, what is love? Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but it rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, and it endures all things. Love, Paul says, never ends. Ask anybody that's been married 20, 30, 40, 50 years what it takes. It takes a deep, abiding love that you never give up on, no matter what life might bring. There's a little book that was written by Thich Nhat Hanh. I enjoy reading Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't know what he is, a Buddhist monk, I think. But the book is titled True Love. And in that book, he lists 4 elements of what he calls true love. First, he says a loving kindness or benevolence, the desire and ability to bring joy and happiness to the person that you love. The second element is compassion, a desire and ability to ease the pain of the person that you love, which means that you first must gain a deep understanding of the suffering that that person has. You must put yourself in their shoes if you are to help them. The third element he names is joy. He says if there's no joy in love, it's not true love. If you're suffering all the time, if you're crying all the time, if you're making somebody else that you love cry all the time, that's not true love. It's the opposite. And then he lists freedom. He says when you love, you bring freedom to the other person and you don't seek to control them. And you know what? I think that's the way it is with us and with God. God loves us, but God doesn't control us. God gives us our freedom. And so if we love other people, we're not to control them. We're to give them their freedom. Is there a risk? Absolutely. Can you get hurt? Absolutely. But it's a risk that you have to take. Let me say another word about joy. When we learn to truly love in life, we experience joy. And I like what Stanley Hauerwas says about joy in his book, The Peaceable Kingdom. He says, joy is the disposition that comes from our readiness always to be surprised. Or put even more strongly, joy is the disposition that comes from our realization that we can trust in surprises for the sustaining of our lives. We learn to see the simple and most common aspects of our existence, like our friends and our spouses, our children, as sheer gifts to which we have no right, but who are nonetheless present to us. Joy involves paying attention to what's going on in your life. It's hard to believe, but a lot of people can live every day and not pay attention to what's happening. Joy should come to us in the little things, the things that we often overlook, the things that we often take for granted. And when we learn to love and appreciate the people and the things that we have in our lives, then we can experience joy. As we move through this series this summer, over the next few weeks. As we talk about each of these fruits of the Spirit, I don't just want to talk about these from some removed, esoteric perspective from the outside. I want to talk about how each of us can look at our Christian faith as a way to grow spiritually each and every day. Because talking about it doesn't matter if it's not transforming and changing your heart. And a lot of people can talk about faith and can talk about spirituality, but ultimately it doesn't change them. It doesn't change who they are. It doesn't change how they see the world. And I think that's important. I want to close this morning with a story that some of you have heard before. I've told it a few times since coming to Woodmont. Some of you might not have heard it, but I think this story has some profound spiritual implications to it. It's a story of a successful businessman who worked on Wall Street. And every summer he'd go down to Mexico to this little coastal village where he would relax and get renewed and rest and then come back to his busy job. Well, one day he was out looking out over the ocean, and all the fishing boats were out. And he saw this one little fishing boat coming back in to the dock, and he saw this old fisherman who had caught several large yellowfin tuna. And he said, I don't understand. Why is this guy coming back so early? So he walked down to talk to this guy, and he said, hey, something wrong with your boat? He said, no, boat's fine. Had it 20 years, been a great boat. Well, did you catch a bunch of fish? Oh, yeah, I've got some fish. Some I'm going to take home for my family, and some I'm going to sell to the market. Well, why'd you come in so early? You just tired of fishing? He said, no, I got plenty of fish for my family and for me, and I don't need to fish anymore. And he said, you know what? Today's your lucky day because I live in New York and I work on Wall Street and I got an MBA from Harvard. I'm going to help you fix your problem. The fisherman said, problem? He said, yeah. He said, here's what you need to do. You need to go buy another boat, get somebody to work for you, and you can fish longer, catch more fish. And then after that, you can buy another boat, catch even more fish, sell the fish, and make more money. Then after that, you can move to Mexico City, buy a big boat, and you can catch a lot of fish and continue to grow your business. Then what would I do, the fisherman said. He said, then you can move to Los Angeles, and you can fish off the western coast of the United States, and you can grow your enterprise, and you can make even more money and hire more people to work for you. Well, then what can I do, the fisherman said. He said, well, then you can come to New York. That's where I live. And you can list your fishing company as an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, and you can make millions and millions of dollars, more money than you'd ever want in your lifetime. And the man said, more money than I'd ever want in a lifetime? He said, yes. And the fisherman sat there and thought for a minute, and he said, well, then what would I do? And the businessman was kind of stumped. He said, well, then you could move to a little coastal village in Mexico, and you could go out in the morning and you could fish for a few hours, and you could come home and you could see your kids and take a nap with your wife, and then you could have dinner with your family and go into town and sip wine and play the guitar with your friends.